Well, we're up to one of the most fun issues, right? The one we don't talk about much in church.
You pick the big ones, don't you?
The big ones. Well,
Good.
you know, this is what we historically do, right? We don't talk about stuff, especially in church. God forbid you talk about issues of real importance in society and culture. That'd be scary. Easy to talk about redemption, hard to talk about sex. But, you know, that's a huge preoccupation of our culture and ourselves, and that's what we'll talk about today. I didn't draw them on the board. I guess I need to, because this is what we're going to look at. Oh, not a very good pen. Science, legal and law, history, culture, OT, NT, and harm. So, just like we've done with every other subject, what we do is we look at each construct and we evaluate the issue in each construct. And just like, you know, just like the issues before, that is life issues, which isn't it interesting that life issues and reproductive issues really share a lot in common. But there's differences we'll talk about. But it's interesting they segue into each other. So, and I guess I should start. I start with this. First of all, you know, we're not eliciting my opinion nor your opinion. What we're trying to do is determine what is truth. So what can we prove in the scientific construct, legal construct, history, culture, Old Testament, New Testament, and harm? What can we prove? So we use the tools. And the tools we have are the scientific method, the legal historical method, and logic. So, you know, opinions are great. If you have opinions, share them. I'll try to identify if I'm sharing an opinion. But opinions become an issue of ethics and moral, right? As opposed to understanding what we can prove or what we can know. So, that's number one. Number two is this class is about determining truth. Number one, so you can know it. You can tell others about it. But then the second point is, the reason for this class is that so you have the ammunition you need, the tools you need to be able to discuss these subjects with people that you might not ever otherwise have an opportunity to share with. So, as we've discovered, if you stick in the scientific construct, you might be able to have a strong discussion with someone, especially if you've got some ammunition in hand, right? But what's the biggest problem between these constructs? What happens in most of our discussions that causes issues? We mix them up. If you start mixing the constructs, if you know what you're doing and you understand when you're mixing with constructs, you know, then you can do a pretty good job of segueing between constructs. We've done that. But if you don't understand, this is why people get flustered, this is why people get all confused, this is why issues get mixed up, is because you're talking in a Old Testament, New Testament construct about what you believe, right? And someone else is trying to have a conversation with you about scientific construct issues. And as long as you don't start mixing them up, you're okay. You start mixing them up, and you have issues. If you can identify when you're mixing them up, that can give you some power, right? In understanding what's going on, and also in maybe convincing people. But that's the point of this class. And then, of course, once we determine what we can prove, what's the next step? What's the homework step? Once you know what you can prove, the next step is called ethos or ethics. And so what you do is, that is opinion. Ethics is opinion. If you know the truth, however, what's the basis for now your ethical or your moral decisions? Based on truth. But this is what I keep warning you about in this class. We've already touched some really touchy issues. And I showed you proofs, right? And some of you go, well, I'm not sure I accept those proofs. What makes you not want to accept some of the truth that we determine? Logically, for example.
Our culture.
Well, opinions based in our culture. right now, we're going to touch some touchy issues that based in our culture, we've got some strong opinions in our culture, right? But I'm going to show you what we can prove from a scientific standpoint. And then let's see where it happens. But, you know, this is very important stuff. We use our tools. So let's start with the tools. Number one, we define things, right? So let's define something. Can anybody tell me what the purpose of sex is?
Reproduction. In the scientific.
In the scientific construct, the purpose of sex is reproduction. And science represents scientific methods, you know, legal historical method as applied to science. So, in science, in scientific construct, sex has only one purpose, and that purpose is reproduction. Everything comes out of that. Everything comes out of that. Sex, we call it mating, itself is a physical act, but the reproduction is the point. Reproduction is the only point. Now this is very important. I'm going to bring up a term that we usually as Christians don't like to talk about. It's a very important term. But before I do that, let's think about this very quickly. In nature, in science, how important is reproduction? Okay, extremely. How important is reproduction?
Termination of DNA.
Remember in our harm construct, 9 is death. What happens to a culture, a society, a group of animals if they don't reproduce?
They come on the endangered species list.
Or worse, right? So we just want to put this in perspective. Now, what this is called in science, there's a term for it. A very important term for it. And this term is fitness. It isn't the fitness you get when you go out to the ladies' fitness center or the guys' fitness center or whatever they call those places, you know, the Gold's Gym, right? When science talks about fitness, they're talking about Darwinian fitness. And this is important because we don't like to talk about evolutionary type terms or terms of fitness, but just because we don't like to think about them or talk about them doesn't mean they don't exist. Because you know that Darwinian fitness does exist. What is Darwinian fitness?
Survival of the fittest.
Well, you know, survival of the fittest, that's nothing wrong with that. That's close. It's really not survival of the fittest. It's survival of those who reproduce
And see their grandchildren.
and see their grandchildren. This is very important. When I talk about fitness, the definition of fitness in science is not that you reproduce, it's that you see your children reproduce. This is a very critical thing, because in human beings, what does that mean?
Your generation is protected. It's going to carry on.
If you are just, okay, and you know, we have got to get this very clear, because this is what Darwinian fitness teaches. What do you have to have, according to Darwinian fitness, for a human family element to reproduce successfully? What do you have to have for a human? Okay, I'm not talking about culture here.
Male and female is all I can think of.
What does that male and female have to do? All right, sure. The male just plants the seed and the lady just goes off, right? And has a baby.
Yeah.
Is that fitness?
Nurture.
Family.
Well, why would you do that? Because fitness depends on seeing your offspring reach reproduction. So that means who has to be around if you want to see that?
At least one parent.
No, not one parent.
At least.
Okay, I'm the father. I provide the sperm. I've got to see, if I'm going to have highest level of fitness, what must I see? Now, how do I know it's my child? If that lady I happen to pick is out messing with the other guys, how do I know it's my progeny? Now, nature in science has given us some great papers on this. Did you know that most children look like their fathers? Enormous amount of papers showing this. That you ever wondered, ladies, why the children kind of look like the dads? Nature has done that because nature wants to ensure that guess who's hanging around? And you say, well, that's not the strategy of salmon. What does salmon do?
Volume.
Well, volume. I got 1 million eggs and I die. But I've just put out 1 million eggs. What is human strategy? Generally one at a time. Right? Do you guys see this? It's very important because science defines fitness as seeing your grandchildren, basically. Seeing your children reach reproductive age, and it ain't just one. You know, why do we have this thing about single parents? Because that's not nature. That's not what science tells us. Every paper I've read has shown negatives for having single parents. I don't care if it's mom or dad or whoever it is. Any of you believe that having it being...
Just humans, right?
What's that?
You're talking just humans, right?
I'm talking humans, but this applies across every animal.
Because not all animal societies have both mom and dad. For instance, the elephants. Whenever you see a herd of elephants with babies, it's all going to be moms and babies. Daddies are off someplace else.
Guess what? Animals don't have societies. Animals don't produce anything. There are some animals, mostly, guess what? Monkeys. The higher level animals who do this. Right? Why have they developed strategies in nature that require a mom and dad, right? Both sexes, male and female.
It's the most successful model.
Because it is a successful model.
Some birds do.
Some birds do. Now, you know, we like to think of ourselves not being animals, but you know, yeah, as science, we can think of ourselves as animals, right? Okay, because that's in the scientific point. What are humans? Homo sapien animals. Okay, so I'm just asking you to take a point here and just think about this, how it is. But the most important thing we have to realize is you have to have the highest level of fitness as a human being. Just like the highest level of fitness as an elephant. And the highest level of fitness as an elephant, it's not just one female, right? It's multiple females.
Right, but it's not mom and dad.
Right, because they're elephants. And neither is amoebas mom and dad, because they don't have sexes. Right? But the point is that in human beings, you got to have mom and dad.
Well, that's what I was asking, if you were talking about just humans or all, and you said all animals.
All animals have Darwinian fitness, and however it's defined for that animal. Because like I said, salmon do it how? By having millions of eggs. If you guys want to produce millions of offspring and have one survive, that'll work, right?
They don't say
That-
Two, you'd need two.
But guess what? You ain't made that way. You ain't going to produce, matter of fact, women do not have 1 million eggs available to do this. So you can't even do this technique if you wanted to. Plus, swimming upstream is pretty tough stuff. So you don't have gills either. But do you see my point? It doesn't matter that we're talking about humans or elephants or salmon. What matters is Darwinian fitness. Yes, sir.
But when you talk about salmon, you're also talking about the food chain. If you get right down to it, you're talking about the food chain, that which feeds us, salmon, tuna, you know.
Yeah. Well,
So this is God's will.
Yeah, we have a salmon on.
all right. Now, what you just did, what did you just do?
Jumps in the
You just jumped into the OT Nute construct. You see this? Now, this is the thing that will drive your secular friends crazy, and this is why they won't listen to you. I'm going to be straight up. Because if we're talking in the scientific construct and you suddenly jump over here, bang, you may have just lost your argument. So you have to be cautious. Now, if somebody's receptive to that, that's okay. There's nothing wrong. And we are all receptive, right? I mean, I think that's great. This is great. This is good stuff. But you see this. I like to point this out because this is what happens in our conversations. We start out with someone in this construct, and guess what happens? If we do it, we just shut ourselves in the foot.
They
See?
may not be knowledgeable on the subject in the Old Testament,
Generally, what they'll do is, what will they try to move to?
something they're comfortable with.
Something that they're comfortable with, or they'll try to argue, some other thing. So you want to stick in a construct. But just to define this, okay, fitness means you see your offspring reproduce. And it begins with sex. Sex, the purpose of sex, the only purpose of sex is reproduction. That's the only purpose for sex. So guess what? Let's just look at this. Science directly supports some things that we think are pretty important. What does science obviously support?
Marriage.
The idea of marriage. Now, polygamy is okay because one guy, a bunch of ladies. Now, one lady with a bunch of guys probably less effective, but the reason polygamy works is why? One guy, multiple women. He sees his progeny, right? And that has been a model in the past. What doesn't work?
Man and a man.
Homosexual activity cannot work. Homosexual activity, science cannot support it because what's the point of homosexual activity?
Shallow gene pool, diminishing product.
Well, there's no reproduction. Extinction is the only thing. Sex outside of human species has zero fitness. That's craziness. Sex outside of a long-term relationship, what does that give you?
Weakens the,
Your fitness is low. And remember, in Darwinian fitness, now, you see this. If I'm arguing from an evolutionary model, that's what we're doing right now. We're arguing from an evolutionary model. What do you want in an evolutionary model? Darwinian fitness has to be
increasing.
high, right? So for the highest level of fitness, Darwinian fitness, for the highest level of evolutionary fitness, therefore, what do you want? Long-term relationship, what we call marriage, right? At least until you see your offspring reproduce, right? Sounds like marriage to me. Science supports one concept in human affairs, and that is a long-term relationship. Science would say these guys that go out and get women pregnant and then run off,
Takes a village.
that's just stupidity. Well, it doesn't take a village, hopefully not that kind of village. In any case, how about contraception? Science would say contraception is
Counterproductive.
really stupid, right? Because you want to reproduce. With contraception, you don't want to reproduce. How about abortion? Really bad. How about sexual disease?
Self-limiting.
So, okay, now remember, we don't apply value judgments. But science would tell you that in a value judgment, what's marriage? Good. Homosexuality is bad.
The ministry's home.
Sounds like Catholic Church all of a sudden, right? Do you see this? We culturally have gotten some things in our minds that are interesting. Let's look at this a little bit further. A lot of today's sociologists have brought forth some idea that, for example, that the reason we see homosexuality, for example, in cultures is because the human species is over-reproducing. And therefore, because you're over-reproducing, homosexuality comes in as an effect. Now, number one, can homosexuality ever be genetic? How could it be genetic?
Because even when you study human embryology, a lot of things have to come together and hormonally controlled.
Can it be a normative chromosomal trait?
It's not normative, but you can have.
It can't be a normative human trait because of what? Why can't it? Why can it not be a normative human trait?
You can't propagate it.
Because you can't propagate it. What happens if it cannot? Number one, it can't be a major chromosomal trait. You guys remember major and minors?
Sure.
Remember that from your from your studies? So in a major, chromosomal trait, it means a trait that, will fall, and I don't want to draw the charts, but you know what I'm talking about. That if you'll have a 1 1/4 chance of a minor, and you'll have a 3/4 chance of a major. It can't be a major or a minor. Why can't it be a major or a minor? If homosexuality is propagated in any genetic train, you will not have a race. You will not have anybody. You won't have a people. You won't have the animals will die out.
It would have
Breed
died
it
out.
out.
It would have died out the first
Declining
generation of
population.
homosexuals.
The other reason, yes, that's right, it would decline. The other reason why homosexuality cannot be a reproductive, that is a normative chromosomal trait is because theoretically homosexuals don't reproduce. So therefore, if they have that trait, what is the chance of propagation?
Fails big
Zero.
time.
Relatively low, or 0. The
Yeah,
other,
and not to belabor the point, but
Yeah.
but theoretically they can produce.
Yeah.
well, they could,
With a great deal of
but
technology.
if it's really a
Right.
genetic trait, would they want to reproduce?
Yeah.
Really? If it's a genetic trait, you'd want to reproduce with another male? You can't reproduce with another male.
You could-
That means that they would have to go against their genetic programming to go for a female, a male, for example, for a female, or a female for a, they'd have to go against their genetic programming. So therefore, if they can go against their genetic programming, it is not
Yes, but genetic programming
Genetic.
says that they have to reproduce, but there's multiple ways of getting that done nowadays.
I disagree. Science tells you that they disagree. What do you mean by multiple ways of getting it done? You have to see your progeny reproduce. As far as I know, there's only one way to reproduce, guys.
Then why haven't homosexuals died gone away?
Well, there's two things for that. The two theories scientifically are, number one, it's a birth defect. And it could be. It could be a chromosomal abnormality,
Okay.
which is always possible because everyone has mitochondrial and normative DNA problems. But that means it's a birth defect. And it could be a birth defect. The problem with that, what's the problem with that argument? Birth defects tend to be unique or semi-unique. And a birth defect that is very negative would tend to be bred out early. So therefore, you wouldn't see that kind of birth defect as a normative birth defect. It would be a unique birth defect. The other problem is, why? Nurture versus nature, right? All of you probably have homicidal tendencies. All humans have homicidal tendencies. The reason you don't is hopefully your parents and someone taught you culturally that it's not a good idea, right? You ever seen a toddler in a tantrum? You don't think there's if that toddler had a knife in their hands, you would probably be at great risk. So, the point is that all people have problems. However, most people do not have problems that are self-destructive of an entire group. Remember harm? Most people's self-destructive nature tends to be what kind of harm?
Against others.
No, against themselves. Individual harm. See? Most people don't have a means of thinking beyond their own harm, or causing their own harm. Those that do are what are those? Sociopaths, right? I mean, if I want to cause harm to Carl, that's really bad, right? On the other hand, if I cause my own harm, that's normal, right? So there's varying degrees of that, but generally, whatever. But the point is this: science in no way supports homosexuality. If you also want to look at it this way, in biology, no animal species, for example, uses reproductive strategies to cull their herds.
To what?
To remove, like if I have too many amoebas, amoeba's not a good example. If I have too many birds or elk or whatever in a area of land, what generally culls the elk? Starvation, the food supply.
Or predators,
Disease,
rise of
predators.
predators.
Rise of predators, rise of disease. You also have like lemmings will we see that cetaceans, porpoises
Of the apocalypse.
will basically, run themselves up on a beach. So you see self-culling, that is self-killing, and you also see, non-reproductive strategies. Because what would happen, why wouldn't nature show any anti-reproductive strategies?
Dead end.
because anti-reproductive strategies lead to extinction. And nothing, see, just dying from starvation doesn't lead to extinction, because what happens to the rest of the herd that's left that have really good fitness? They continue on. Now this is where our normal concept of fitness is. Our normal concept of fitness is the strong survive, right? So in a culling situation like that, yeah, the strong will survive. It's just important to note these things within science, because science says that homosexuality is not a very good thing. Right? Science says contraception is not a good thing. Science says abortion is not a good thing. Science says that these are really bad things for human species. So, it's important to note this. In any case, let's move on to legal. What about man's law?
Heavily dependent upon harm and culture.
Yeah, harm and culture. Well, let's talk about legal. Why do you think we have all these laws, for example, in America? Why do you think we have all these laws in the book against, for example, sodomy, against adultery? When did those occur, do you think? When did those first get on the books? Just
Quite a long time ago, the sanctity of marriage.
we like to think that a lot of them occurred in the, from the Old Testament, New Testament, and have a legacy. Some of them do, for example, adultery, but I'm going to show you how that's an interesting concept. In reality, we got a lot of these laws. Give me just a second. A lot of these laws came out of the Age of Enlightenment. I'll explain it to you. Go ahead, Rick.
I was just going to make the comment that societies that had no connection to the Old Testament or New Testament still developed the same types of laws throughout time.
Yeah. Let's talk about this. Let's see how this fits. Why do you think in the Age of Enlightenment a lot of the laws became in effect, for example, especially laws against sodomy and laws against homosexual activity, laws against... What do you think caused that in the Age of Enlightenment? Science. Because remember, Darwin is the late Age of Enlightenment. Age of Enlightenment, people began to try to put scientific principle into law. And many of the scientific principles they put into law ended up being the laws we had. The laws there were laws against adultery, for example. This is something very interesting. What do we do right now, legally, in this country,
One man,
for sex?
one woman.
What do they do?
Anything goes.
Well, no, legally.
Ignore
We license you. You're licensed. We have a marriage license. It allows us to have sex. Do you know that? You pay the government money for a license. Right? You have a license to have sex. What happens if you don't have a license and you have sex?
Common law marriage.
No, they ignore it. It's ignored. Now, how is that? What's with that over? I mean, can you imagine anything else? Where you have a license, like if I have a license for a business, and what does the government do? They come and inspect my business every year, and they check to make sure I'm not, and if I don't have a license, what do? They fine me, they put me in jail. But yet, we have, in this country, and in most countries, a license to have sex, a license for marriage, and yet there is no prosecutional activity for those who have sex outside of marriage. Now, do you remember where I told you all our laws originally came from? From the Age of Enlightenment. Some laws came from this period, but the idea of disease, you see, these guys don't know about disease. Disease does not exist in the Old New Testament. I've talked about that before, I don't have time to get into great detail. There's no such thing as disease. They have no idea. In the Age of Enlightenment, we started to realize that diseases were a big problem. So guess what most states make you do to get your license to have sex? You have to have an STD test, which is interesting. Do you know that one of the big problems in homosexuality is that what is one of the primary disease vectors in really bad human diseases? Homosexuality. Matter of fact, there used to be 7 diseases that were the great virulent human diseases. Typhus, cholera, bubonic plague, smallpox. I mean, there's a whole list, right? All of those, the primary disease vector is homosexuality, except for smallpox. And now HIV is the 8th most virulent human disease. And guess what the primary vector is? Is homosexual sex. So science tells us that that it's a bad thing. And guess what the Age of Enlightenment did? They put laws into place to prevent that because they saw it as a public